In 1975, a Maryland cold case would haunt a community for over 4 decades, before an arrest finally shocked everyone who thought they knew the truth. Katherine Lyon, 10 years old, and her sister Sheila, 12, walked to Wheaton Plaza on a bright March morning laughing, planning to buy music and treats. They were last seen talking to a man with a tape recorder and microphone, their voices captured in time before vanishing forever. By evening, their dinner grew cold. By midnight, police sirens cut through suburban silence. For 42 years, their family waited. Investigators chased thousands of leads. The community locked their doors and questioned every neighbor, every stranger, every shadow. But when Lloyd Lee Welch Jr.'s name surfaced in dusty files, when his own family members began breaking their silence about dark secrets buried in Virginia hillsides, the truth became more devastating than anyone imagined. How could an entire family keep such a horrific secret for so long? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning of March 25, 1975, started like any other Tuesday in Wheaton, Maryland. Katherine Lyon, 10 years old with her mother's gentle smile, sat at the kitchen table finishing her cereal while sketching horses in her drawing pad. Her artistic mind was always creating, always imagining worlds beyond their quiet suburban street. Across from her, 12-year-old Sheila hummed a popular song, her voice clear and sweet as she planned their afternoon adventure. "Mom, we're gonna look at records and maybe get some treats," Sheila announced, her protective nature already evident as she included her younger sister in every plan. Mary Lyon smiled from the kitchen counter, trusting her daughters as any mother would in their safe neighborhood. The girls had walked to Wheaton Plaza countless times before. It was their familiar path, their routine adventure in a community where children still roamed freely. Katherine closed her drawing pad, leaving behind sketches that would soon become heartbreaking reminders of interrupted dreams. The sisters grabbed their jackets and headed toward the door, their laughter echoing through the house as they discussed which music they wanted to find and what candy they might buy. "Be careful and be back by dinner," Mary called after them, the same words she'd spoken hundreds of times before. The spring air was crisp as the girls walked down their street, then turned toward the plaza. They chattered about school, friends, and the excitement of having spending money. Katherine looked up to her older sister with complete trust, following Sheila's lead as they navigated the familiar sidewalks. At Wheaton Plaza, the sisters browsed the record store, their voices mixing with other shoppers as they debated their choices. But somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, something extraordinary and terrible was about to unfold, something that would shatter their family and haunt their community for decades to come. Evening shadows stretched across the Lyon family kitchen as Mary glanced at the clock for the 100th time, 6:30. The dinner she'd prepared sat cooling on the stove, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all growing cold while she waited for familiar voices at the door. John Lyon arrived home from work to find his wife pacing by the window, her face etched with worry that had been building all afternoon. The untouched dinner plates sat on the table like silent accusations, representing the moment when parental concern transformed into genuine fear. "They should have been home hours ago," Mary whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. John tried to remain calm, suggesting logical explanations. Maybe the girls had lost track of time. Maybe they'd run into friends. Maybe they'd decided to walk around the plaza longer than planned. But even as he spoke these comforting words, unease crept into his chest. By 7 o'clock, Mary had called the homes of Katherine and Sheila's friends, her voice growing more strained with each conversation. No, Katherine and Sheila hadn't been seen. No, they hadn't mentioned any different plans. The responses all carried the same underlying message. This wasn't normal. At 7:30, John put on his jacket and drove to Wheaton Plaza. The parking lot was nearly empty, the stores preparing to close for the evening. He walked through the corridors calling his daughters' names, his voice echoing off the walls as shopkeepers shook their heads sympathetically. Back home, Mary sat by the phone, willing it to ring with news that her daughters were safe. But as 8 o'clock came and went, then 9, the terrible truth began to settle over the Lyon household like a suffocating blanket. At 9:15, John's hand trembled as he dialed the police. "My daughters are missing," he said, the words feeling foreign and impossible even as he spoke them. Within minutes of John's call, Wheaton transformed from a quiet suburb into a scene of urgent activity. Police cars with flashing lights converged on the Lyon home as officers began the methodical process of organizing a search. Detective flashlights cut through the darkness as the first official tools were deployed in what would become one of Maryland's largest missing persons investigations. The initial response was swift and comprehensive. Officers spread throughout the neighborhood, their flashlight beams sweeping across yards, parks, and any place 2 young girls might have wandered or gotten lost. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sirens and flashing lights, quickly learning about Katherine and Sheila's disappearance. Mary and John provided recent photographs of their daughters to the responding officers. Katherine's gentle smile and artistic spirit shone through her school picture, while Sheila's confidence and protective nature were evident in her bright-eyed gaze. These images would soon become familiar to everyone in the community. Volunteers joined the professional searchers as word spread through the neighborhood. Parents who had been sitting down to their own family dinners abandoned their meals to help look for the Lyon girls. Flashlights bobbed like fireflies through Wheaton streets as the search expanded beyond the immediate area around the plaza. The K-9 units arrived near midnight, their handlers guiding the dogs through the areas where the girls were last seen. The animals sniffed clothing items provided by the Lyon parents, then set off to follow any trace scents. But the trails led nowhere, dissolving into the night air like morning mist. As dawn approached, exhausted searchers gathered to assess their progress. Despite hours of methodical searching through every conceivable location, no sign of Katherine and Sheila had been found. No dropped items, no witnesses with useful information, no indication of where the sisters might have gone. The first night of many without answers had ended, but the search was just beginning. By morning, news vans had descended on Wheaton like an invasion of mechanical vultures. The quiet suburb found itself thrust into the harsh glare of media attention as reporters set up their equipment and began broadcasting the story of 2 missing girls to the wider Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The newspaper clippings that would accumulate over the following days painted a picture of a community in shock. Headlines screamed about the vanished Lyon sisters, while photographs of Katherine and Sheila gazed out from front pages, their innocent faces becoming symbols of every parent's worst nightmare. Fear spread through Wheaton faster than any official announcement could have managed. Parents who had previously allowed their children the freedom to walk to friends' houses or ride bikes around the neighborhood suddenly implemented strict new rules. Children who had roamed freely now found themselves confined to yards and supervised constantly. The local elementary school became a hub of worried conversations as parents dropped off their children with new anxieties. Teachers noticed the change immediately. Students who had been dropped off casually were now walked to the door by vigilant parents who lingered longer than usual. At Wheaton Plaza, the shopping center where Katherine and Sheila were last seen, business owners installed additional security measures and instructed employees to watch for suspicious activity. The once cheerful destination had become associated with danger and loss. Community meetings were hastily organized as residents demanded information and reassurance from local police. The questions came in urgent waves. Were their children safe? Was there a predator in their midst? What precautions should they take? Police Chief Robert Barrett tried to provide calm leadership while acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "We are treating this as our highest priority," he told the packed auditorium of concerned citizens. "But we need the community's help and patience as we conduct a thorough investigation." The sense of security that had defined suburban Wheaton was gone, replaced by a wariness that would persist long after the immediate crisis passed. In the days following the disappearance, Montgomery County Police followed every possible lead with methodical determination. The investigation room filled with reports, witness statements, and photographs as detectives worked around the clock to find any trace of Katherine and Sheila Lyon. Local predators and known sex offenders became immediate persons of interest. Police conducted interviews and alibis checks, searching for anyone with the means, motive, and opportunity to harm 2 young girls. The interviews were intensive and thorough, but none produced the breakthrough investigators desperately sought. Among the many tips and reports that flooded the police station was a curious statement from a young man named Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. He claimed to have seen 2 girls who matched Katherine and Sheila's description at Wheaton Plaza on March 25th, but his story contained inconsistencies and details that didn't align with other witness accounts. Detective investigators noted Welch's report in their files, but with dozens of similar tips coming in daily, his false information was filed away without extensive follow-up. The report would sit dormant for decades, its true significance hidden beneath layers of more seemingly credible leads. Other witnesses provided more consistent accounts of seeing Katherine and Sheila talking to a man with a tape recorder and microphone near the plaza. These sightings created a timeline of the girls' last known movements, but the mystery man with the recording equipment remained unidentified. Polygraph tests were administered to various suspects and witnesses, including some who had offered information about the case. The results eliminated some persons of interest while raising questions about others, but none provided the definitive answers investigators needed. As April progressed without a breakthrough, the massive search operation began to show signs of strain. Resources were stretched thin, and the initial burst of community energy started to give way to frustrated exhaustion. Still, police maintained their commitment to finding Katherine and Sheila, even as the leads grew thinner and the trail grew colder with each passing day. The Lyon family home became a monument to interrupted lives as Mary and John struggled to navigate their new reality. Katherine and Sheila's bedrooms remained exactly as the girls had left them. On that March morning, beds unmade, clothes scattered, personal belongings frozen in time like exhibits in a tragic museum. Mary found herself drawn to her daughter's rooms multiple times each day, sitting on their beds and touching their belongings as if physical contact could somehow bridge the growing distance. Katherine's drawing pad lay open to her last sketch, a half-finished horse that would never be completed. Sheila's record collection sat perfectly organized, waiting for hands that would never return to play them again. The community rallied around the Lyon family with remarkable dedication and compassion. Neighbors brought meals, offered childcare for the family's other children, and provided emotional support during the darkest hours. Church members organized prayer vigils and maintained a network of care that sustained the family through their initial grief. John returned to work after several weeks, finding routine to be both a blessing and a curse. The normalcy of his job provided temporary respite from the constant worry, but every phone call could potentially bring news about his daughters. His coworkers learned to recognize the particular tension in his face when he answered his office phone. Letters of support arrived from across the country as news of the Lyon sisters' disappearance spread beyond the Washington, D.C. area. Families who had experienced similar tragedies reached out to share their strength and understanding. These connections provided some comfort, even as they highlighted the terrible reality that the Lyons had joined an unwanted fraternity of families with missing children. At night, Mary would sit by the window looking out at the street, hoping against hope to see two familiar figures walking up the sidewalk toward home. These vigils became a ritual of desperate faith, maintained even as the likelihood of such a miracle diminished with each passing sunset. As months turned into years, the active search for Katherine and Sheila Lyon gradually gave way to the stark reality of limited resources and competing priorities. The file storage boxes containing evidence and witness statements were moved to a dedicated cold case section, their contents carefully cataloged but no longer examined on a daily basis. New crimes demanded the attention of detectives who had spent months focused on the Lyon case. While the girl's disappearance remained officially open and active, the day-to-day reality was that fresh leads had dried up and alternative approaches had been exhausted. The massive volunteer search efforts that had characterized the early weeks of the investigation could not be sustained indefinitely. Community members returned to their normal routines while maintaining awareness and hope that someone, somewhere, might still provide the crucial information needed to solve the case. Police Chief Barrett established a policy that any credible lead related to the Lyon sisters would receive immediate attention, regardless of how much time had passed. This commitment provided some comfort to the family, even as the practical reality was that such leads became increasingly rare. The case files grew thick with reports and theories, but none had produced the breakthrough that investigators desperately sought. Polygraph results, witness interviews, and physical evidence searches had eliminated numerous suspects without identifying the person responsible for the girl's disappearance. Other missing children cases across the country were compared to the Lyon disappearance, looking for patterns or connections that might provide new investigative direction. These comparisons occasionally generated temporary optimism, but none resulted in substantial progress. As the 1970s drew to a close, the Lyon case had become one of the most extensively investigated missing persons cases in Maryland history. Yet, Katherine and Sheila remained as lost as they had been on that first night when their dinner grew cold on the kitchen table. The 1978s and 1990s passed with agonizing slowness for the Lyon family as their daughter's case became part of Washington, D.C. area lore. Each year, on the anniversary of Katherine and Sheila's disappearance, local news stations would air remembrance segments featuring their school photographs and appeals for information from the public. These anniversary news coverage pieces served multiple purposes. They kept the case in public consciousness, provided the Lyon family with a platform to maintain hope, and occasionally generated new tips from viewers who remembered details they hadn't previously shared with police. The community of Wheaton adapted to living with an unsolved mystery in its midst. Parents who had restricted their children's movements in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance maintained many of those precautions, creating a generation that grew up with less freedom than their predecessors had enjoyed. Local schools incorporated stranger safety education into their curricula, with Katherine and Sheila's story serving as a sobering reminder of why such precautions were necessary. The sisters became symbols of vigilance and caution, their memory serving to protect other children. Mary and John Lyon aged visibly during these decades, their faces bearing the particular weariness that comes from carrying unresolved grief. They participated in every anniversary interview and media appeal, their voices steady, but their eyes holding depths of pain that never fully healed. Other families in similar situations reached out to form informal support networks. The Lyons found themselves mentoring other parents whose children had vanished, sharing hard-won wisdom about surviving uncertainty and maintaining hope across years of silence. As the case approached its 20th anniversary, then its 25th, it seemed possible that Katherine and Sheila Lyon would join the ranks of missing persons whose fates would never be known. Their files waited patiently for fresh eyes and new perspectives that might finally unlock their secrets. The early 2000s brought new hope to cold cases across the country as advances in DNA technology and fresh investigative approaches breathed life into long-dormant files. Montgomery County Police established a dedicated cold case unit, staffed by experienced detectives who specialized in reviewing old evidence with modern techniques and perspectives. Detective Chris Humrock and his team approached the Lyon case with the methodical patience that had been refined through years of working similar investigations. They understood that time, while an enemy in the immediate aftermath of a crime, could also be an ally as witnesses became willing to share information they had previously withheld and as new technologies revealed evidence that had been invisible decades earlier. The dust-covered evidence boxes were reopened with ceremony and reverence, their contents spread across conference tables like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Each piece of paper, each photograph, each statement was examined with fresh eyes, trained to see patterns and connections that earlier investigators might have missed. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Thousands of tips had been investigated over the years, creating a paper trail that documented not just the search for Katherine and Sheila, but the evolution of investigative techniques across 3 decades. Computer databases allowed for new types of analysis and cross-referencing that had been impossible in 1975. Names and connections that had been scattered across hundreds of individual reports could now be compiled and analyzed systematically. The cold case team established new protocols for reviewing witness statements, paying particular attention to individuals who had provided multiple tips or whose stories had changed over time. These inconsistencies, once viewed as signs of unreliability, were now recognized as potentially significant indicators of hidden knowledge. As the boxes yielded their secrets, certain names began to appear with suspicious frequency, and one name in particular caught the attention of the reviewing detectives: Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. Lloyd Welch's name had appeared in the original case files, but buried among thousands of other tips and statements, his information had not received the scrutiny it deserved. Now, with decades of hindsight and improved analytical tools, the pattern of his involvement became clearer and more troubling. Witness statement forms from 1975 revealed that multiple people had noticed Welch at Wheaton Plaza on March 25th, the day Katherine and Sheila disappeared. His behavior had struck several observers as odd or suspicious, but in the chaos and urgency of the initial investigation, these observations had not been properly connected. Detective Humrock began to construct a timeline of Welch's activities on the day of the disappearance. The young man had been seen loitering near the area where the Lyon sisters were last spotted. His demeanor was described by witnesses as agitated and watchful, as if he was waiting for something or someone. More troubling still were inconsistencies in the information Welch had provided to police. His original statement claimed he had seen 2 girls who might have been Katherine and Sheila, but his description of events changed when he was interviewed multiple times. These variations, once dismissed as the confusion of a young witness, now appeared to be the deliberate misdirection of someone with guilty knowledge. Background investigations into Welch revealed a pattern of petty crimes and troubling behavior that extended back to his teenage years. He had a history of providing false information to authorities and had been suspected, though never charged, in connection with other incidents involving young girls. The cold case team began to focus their investigation on Welch's associations and whereabouts in the months following the Lyon sisters' disappearance. Phone records from the 1970s were incomplete, but other documentary evidence painted a picture of a young man whose life had taken several mysterious turns after March 1975. As investigators dug deeper into Welch's background, they began to uncover a web of family connections and secrets that would prove to be far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came when investigators began interviewing Lloyd Welch's family members with the persistence and sophistication that had been lacking in the original investigation. Decades of silence began to crack under the weight of guilty consciences and the skilled questioning of experienced cold case detectives. The recorded interview tapes revealed a family dynamic marked by fear, secrecy, and complicity in crimes that went far beyond what anyone had previously suspected. Welch's relatives, now older and more willing to speak, began sharing information that painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Katherine and Sheila Lyon. Richard Welch, Lloyd's uncle, emerged as a central figure in the conspiracy. Family members described him as a domineering and violent man who controlled his relatives through intimidation and threats. His influence over the younger members of the family, including Lloyd, was described as complete and terrifying. The interviews revealed that the crime had not been a spontaneous act by a single perpetrator, but rather a planned abduction carried out with the assistance of multiple family members. The scope of the conspiracy was shocking in its breadth and the callousness of its execution. Most disturbing of all were the revelations about what had happened after the abduction. Family members spoke in hushed, guilt-ridden voices about trips to Bedford County, Virginia, where Richard Welch owned property. They described fires that had burned longer and hotter than normal fires, and ash that had been scattered in remote locations. The Virginia connection explained why no trace of Katherine and Sheila had been found despite extensive searches in Maryland. The girls had been transported across state lines to a location where evidence of their fate could be more easily destroyed. As more family members broke their silence, a picture emerged of a decades-long cover-up that had protected the perpetrators while allowing the Lyon family to suffer in uncertainty. The conspiracy of silence had been maintained through fear, family loyalty, and the terrible shared knowledge of an unforgivable crime. Armed with information from the family interviews, investigators launched extensive search operations in Bedford County, Virginia. The excavation tools and heavy equipment that arrived at the rural sites created a scene that was both hopeful and heartbreaking as investigators tried to recover physical evidence of Katherine and Sheila's fate. The Virginia property owned by Richard Welch was subjected to intensive analysis using ground-penetrating radar and other modern search techniques. Areas that had been identified by family members as significant were marked for excavation, creating a methodical grid across the rural landscape. Forensic anthropologists worked alongside investigators as the search expanded beyond surface areas to include more extensive digging operations. The specialists knew that after nearly 4 decades, any physical evidence would be fragmentary and difficult to identify definitively. The discovery of bone fragments and ash in several locations provided both hope and heartbreak. Each fragment was carefully documented and sent for analysis, with investigators understanding that positive identification might be impossible, but that the evidence still contributed to the overall understanding of what had occurred. The search operations drew media attention that brought fresh scrutiny to the case, while also providing the Lyon family with visible proof that authorities had not given up. Mary and John Lyon visited the Virginia sites, their presence a testament to their enduring commitment to finding answers about their daughter's fate. Forensic analysis of the recovered materials suggested that fires had indeed been used to destroy evidence, consistent with the family members' accounts of suspicious burning activities. The extreme heat required to reduce organic matter to ash fragments supported the theory that the destruction had been deliberate and thorough. While the searches did not produce remains that could be definitively identified as Katherine and Sheila Lyon, they did provide crucial physical evidence that supported the testimony of family members. The combination of witness accounts and physical evidence began to build a compelling case against Lloyd Welch and his co-conspirators. The moment that many had waited decades to see finally arrived when Montgomery County Police held a press conference to publicly identify Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. as the primary suspect in the disappearance of Katherine and Sheila Lyon. The press conference podium became a platform where truth could finally begin to emerge after 4 decades of uncertainty. Detective Homrock stood before a room packed with reporters, investigators, and family members to announce the breakthrough that had been achieved through persistent cold case work. His voice was steady and professional as he outlined the evidence that had led investigators to focus on Welch as the perpetrator. The community reaction was swift and intense. Many residents who had lived through the original trauma of the girl's disappearance gathered around televisions and radios to hear the long-awaited news. For some, the identification of a suspect brought relief. For others, it raised new questions about how Welch had evaded suspicion for so long. John and Mary Lyon sat in the front row of the press conference, their faces composed but their eyes reflecting the complex emotions of finally learning the identity of the person believed to be responsible for their daughter's disappearance. After 40 years of uncertainty, they now had a name and a face to associate with their loss. The announcement also brought scrutiny to the original investigation and questions about whether signs had been missed or opportunities lost. Law enforcement officials addressed these concerns directly, acknowledging that investigative techniques and resources available in 1975 were different from those available in the 2000s. Members of the Wheaton community who remembered the original search efforts expressed a mixture of vindication and sadness. The identification of a suspect validated their long-held belief that the girls had been victims of a crime, but it also forced them to confront the reality that evil had indeed walked among them undetected for decades. The press conference marked the beginning of a new phase in the case, one that would focus on building a prosecutable case against Welch and seeking justice for Katherine and Sheila Lyon. With Lloyd Welch officially identified as the primary suspect, the investigation entered a new phase focused on building a case that would stand up in court. Legal documents began to accumulate as prosecutors worked to translate decades of investigation into a coherent narrative that could be presented to a jury. The prosecution team, led by experienced attorneys who specialized in complex cold cases, faced the challenge of presenting evidence that spanned multiple decades and jurisdictions. They worked closely with investigators to organize witness testimony, physical evidence, and documentary proof into a compelling case. Additional family members were interviewed as investigators sought to understand the full scope of the conspiracy and identify all participants in the crimes. These interviews revealed the extent to which fear and family loyalty had maintained silence for 4 decades. The defense team representing Welch began their own investigation, challenging the reliability of witnesses who were testifying about events that had occurred decades earlier. They questioned whether memories could be trusted after so much time and whether the evidence was sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Welch himself remained largely silent during the initial phases of the prosecution, communicating primarily through his attorneys while the case against him continued to build. His demeanor in court appearances was described by observers as detached and unrepentant. Richard Welch's role as co-conspirator presented additional complications for prosecutors. His death meant that certain aspects of the case could never be fully explored, leaving gaps in the narrative that defense attorneys were quick to highlight. The legal proceedings moved slowly but deliberately as both sides prepared for what was expected to be a complex and emotionally charged trial. The Lyon family worked closely with prosecutors, providing input on evidence and strategy while preparing themselves for the ordeal of revisiting their daughter's disappearance in open court. As pressure mounted on all participants in the case, discussions about possible plea agreements began to emerge behind the scenes. Rather than face a lengthy and uncertain trial, Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. ultimately chose to accept a plea agreement that would resolve the case without forcing the Lyon family to endure the trauma of a public trial. The signed plea agreement became a legal document that brought closure while acknowledging that complete truth might never be revealed. The courtroom scene was heavy with emotion as Welch stood before Judge Robert Greenberg to formally enter his plea of guilty to 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. His voice was barely audible as he acknowledged his role in the deaths of Katherine and Sheila Lyon, speaking the words that the Lyon family had waited more than 4 decades to hear. The plea agreement required Welch to provide information about the crimes and the disposal of the girls' remains, though investigators recognized that his account might never be completely truthful. The agreement represented a compromise between the certainty of conviction and the desire for complete answers. Mary and John Lyon sat in the courtroom gallery, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhaustion. The formal acknowledgement of their daughter's deaths brought a form of closure, but it could never restore what had been taken from them or fill the void left by 42 years of uncertainty. Victim impact statements provided an opportunity for the Lyon family to address the court and express the profound impact that their daughter's disappearance had had on their lives. These statements were delivered with dignity and strength, honoring Katherine and Sheila's memory while acknowledging the devastating consequences of Welch's actions. The judge's acceptance of the plea agreement marked the end of the legal proceedings, but not the end of the Lyon family's journey toward healing. They faced the complex task of processing emotions that had been held in suspension for decades, while finally having confirmation of their worst fears. The courtroom fell silent as the formal proceedings concluded, leaving all participants to grapple with the weight of justice served, but innocence lost forever. Judge Greenberg's pronouncement of a 48-year prison sentence represented the culmination of one of Maryland's longest and most complex criminal investigations. The sentencing document officially closed the legal proceedings while opening new chapters in the lives of everyone affected by the crimes. The Lyon family gathered outside the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by supporters and media representatives who had followed the case for years. Their statement to the press was brief but heartfelt, expressing gratitude to investigators and prosecutors while acknowledging that no sentence could truly compensate for the loss of Katherine and Sheila. Community members who had lived through the original trauma of the girls' disappearance gathered in homes and workplaces to discuss the resolution. Many expressed relief that justice had finally been served, while others struggled with the reality that it had taken more than 4 decades to achieve. The sentence meant that Welch, now in his 60s, would likely spend the remainder of his life in prison. For some observers, this outcome provided satisfaction. For others, it seemed inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes and the suffering he had caused. Investigators who had worked on the case reflected on the long journey from the initial disappearance to the final conviction. Many noted that advances in investigative techniques and technology had been crucial to solving the case, while others emphasized the importance of persistent questioning and refusing to let cold cases remain truly cold. The Lyon family began the process of adjusting to life with answers, a challenge that proved different but equally difficult from living with uncertainty. They had spent decades hoping for resolution while secretly dreading confirmation of their worst fears. As media attention began to fade, the family faced the private work of processing grief that had been complicated by decades of uncertainty and the public nature of their loss. Richard Welch's death certificate arrived like a final frustration, denying the Lyon family and investigators the opportunity to hold him accountable for his role in the crimes. His passing before trial meant that crucial aspects of the conspiracy would never be fully explored in a legal setting. The news of Richard Welch's death reached the Lyon family through their attorneys, adding another layer of complexity to their emotional processing. While they had achieved some justice through Lloyd Welch's conviction, the knowledge that the alleged co-conspirator had escaped earthly judgment created a sense of incomplete resolution. Investigators who had hoped to question Richard Welch about his specific role in the playing, abduction and murder of Katherine and Sheila found themselves working with second-hand accounts and assumptions rather than direct testimony. This limitation affected their understanding of exactly how the crimes had been planned and executed. The death also impacted other family members who had been cooperating with investigators. Some had implicated Richard Welch as the dominant figure in the conspiracy, describing him as the person who had orchestrated the cover-up and maintained family silence through fear and intimidation. Legal experts noted that Richard Welch's death created precedential issues for similar cases, particularly regarding how to handle co-conspirators who die before trial. The lack of cross-examination and formal legal proceedings left questions about his specific culpability unanswered. For the broader community, Richard Welch's death represented a reminder that justice delayed can become justice denied. His ability to avoid consequences for his alleged crimes highlighted the importance of solving cases quickly while all participants are available to face accountability. The Lyon family struggled with feelings of being cheated out of complete justice. even as they recognized that Lloyd Welch's conviction represented a significant victory after decades of uncertainty. The incomplete investigation files that remained after Lloyd Welch's conviction served as stark reminders that some secrets had died with their keepers. Other family members who investigators believed had knowledge of the crimes or participated in the cover-up would never face formal charges, leaving gaps in the complete truth. Prosecutors made the difficult decision to focus their limited resources on the case they could prove rather than pursuing additional charges that might not result in convictions. This pragmatic approach provided closure for the Lyon family while acknowledging that perfect justice remained elusive. Some relatives who had provided testimony about the crimes were granted immunity in exchange for their cooperation, a decision that generated mixed reactions from observers. The immune witnesses had been essential to building the case against Lloyd Welch, but their protection from prosecution troubled those who believed they should also face consequences. The investigation had revealed a family structure built on secrecy, fear, and mutual protection that had enabled the cover-up to persist for decades. Breaking this conspiracy had required investigators to offer incentives that some viewed as allowing accomplices to escape appropriate punishment. Defense attorneys had attempted to use the incomplete nature of the case to create reasonable doubt about Lloyd Welch's guilt, arguing that the full story had never been revealed and that other participants might bear greater responsibility for the crimes. Investigators privately acknowledged their frustration with the limitations they faced in pursuing a complete accounting of all crimes and conspirators. The passage of time had eliminated some evidence and witnesses while creating legal and practical obstacles to comprehensive justice. The Lyon family accepted the partial truth they had received while maintaining hope that additional information might someday emerge to fill in the remaining gaps in their daughter's story. The Lyon family photo album became a sanctuary of memory as John and Mary worked to honor their daughters' lives rather than focusing solely on their deaths. The preserved photographs showed Katherine and Sheila as they had been vibrant, happy children with unlimited potential and dreams that would never be realized. Family gatherings took on new significance as the Lyon parents shared stories about their daughters with grandchildren who had never met their aunts. These oral histories became a way to ensure that Katherine and Sheila would be remembered for who they were rather than how they died. Mary Lyon often spoke about Katherine's artistic talents and her gentle nature, describing a child who saw beauty in the world and tried to capture it in her drawings. These memories provided comfort while also emphasizing the creative potential that had been lost when Katherine's life was cut short. Sheila's protective instincts and musical abilities became central themes in the family's remembrances. Her parents recalled how she had always looked after her younger sister and how her voice had filled their home with joy during the brief time they had together. The process of remembering was both healing and painful as the Lyon family worked to separate their daughter's memories from the trauma of their disappearance. This required conscious effort to focus on the 12 and 10 years of life rather than the circumstances of death. Faith had played a central role in the Lyon family's survival through decades of uncertainty, and it continued to provide strength as they processed the confirmed loss of their daughters. Their religious beliefs offered hope for reunion in an afterlife, while providing framework for understanding their earthly suffering. Other families who had experienced similar losses reached out to share wisdom about balancing grief with celebration of life, helping the Lyons navigate the complex emotional terrain of loss and memory. The memorial plaque installed at Wheaton Plaza served as a permanent tribute to Katherine and Sheila Lyon, ensuring that their names would be remembered by future generations who visited the location where they were last seen alive. The simple bronze marker bore their names, dates, and a brief statement about their disappearance that had changed their community forever. Local schools incorporated the Lyon sisters' story into their safety education programs, using their tragedy as a teaching tool to help other children understand the importance of caution while avoiding the paralysis of constant fear. Teachers found ways to honor the girls' memory while providing practical guidance to students. Community members organized annual remembrance events that drew participants from across the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. These gatherings served multiple purposes, honoring Katherine and Sheila, supporting their family, and raising awareness about missing children issues. The healing process for Wheaton was gradual and imperfect, marked by the recognition that some wounds never fully close but can become manageable with time and community support. Residents who had lived through the original trauma found that the resolution of the case allowed them to process emotions that had been held in suspension for decades. Younger residents who had grown up with the Lyon case as part of their community's history worked to understand how the events had shaped their hometown. Many participated in efforts to ensure that the sisters would be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals whose lives had mattered. The memorial events often featured speakers who emphasized the importance of community vigilance and mutual support in protecting children. These messages helped transform the tragedy into a source of ongoing protection for other families. Local businesses and organizations contributed to scholarship funds established in Katherine and Sheila's names, creating positive legacies that provided educational opportunities for other young people while honoring the sisters' memory. The cold case detectives who had finally solved the Lyon sisters' disappearance carried their own emotional burdens as they reflected on the decades-long journey from initial investigation to final conviction. Their detective badges had become symbols of a duty that extended beyond normal working hours and into personal commitment to justice. Detective Chris Homrock and his team experienced a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal regret as they processed the successful conclusion of the case. While they had achieved justice for Katherine and Sheila, they could not escape the knowledge that earlier resolution might have prevented decades of family suffering. The investigative team held private debriefs to discuss not only the technical aspects of how the case had been solved, but also the emotional impact of working with evidence of such terrible crimes. Many found themselves thinking about their own children and families as they processed the details of what had happened to the Lyon sisters. Some investigators expressed frustration that the case had remained unsolved for so long, wondering whether different decisions or approaches in the original investigation might have led to earlier resolution. These reflections led to discussions about improving cold case procedures and interjurisdictional cooperation. The personal cost of working such cases became evident as team members dealt with stress, sleep disruption, and the emotional weight of confronting human evil in its most concentrated form. Department counselors worked with the investigators to help them process their experiences. Recognition ceremonies honored the detectives' work while acknowledging the bittersweet nature of their success. Awards and commendations could not eliminate the sadness that pervaded any celebration of a case involving murdered children. The investigators found meaning in their work through the knowledge that they had provided answers to a grieving family and potentially prevented Welch from harming other children by ensuring his incarceration. Through the testimony and memories of those who knew them, the voices of Katherine and Sheila Lyon were lifted above the silence that had surrounded their fate for 42 years. The voice recording equipment that had been used to lure them became a haunting echo, but their true voices lived on in the recollections of family and friends. Teachers who had known the girls shared memories of Katherine's quiet creativity and artistic spirit, describing a student who approached assignments with thoughtful care and genuine enthusiasm for learning. Her drawings, preserved by her family, showed a developing talent that would never reach full flower. Sheila's friends remembered her laugh and her protective nature, recalling how she had always made sure that younger children felt included in games and activities. Her singing voice, once heard in school concerts and church services, lived on in the memories of those who had been touched by her brief presence. The Lyon family worked with local historians to create a more complete record of their daughters' lives, ensuring that future generations would know Katherine and Sheila as individuals rather than simply as victims of crime. This effort required revisiting happy memories that were now tinged with loss. Community members who had known the girls contributed their own recollections, creating a collective portrait of two children who had been loved and valued by many people. These shared memories helped to counteract the focus on their disappearance and death. Religious services held in the girls' memory emphasized their spiritual significance to the community and their family's faith that they continued to exist in a realm beyond earthly suffering. These services provided comfort while acknowledging the profound loss that could never be fully healed. The silence that had surrounded their fate for so long was finally broken, replaced by voices speaking their names with love and ensuring their memory would endure. The prison gates that closed behind Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. provided physical separation between him and society, but they could not undo the decades of suffering his crimes had caused or fully satisfy the demands of justice. His incarceration represented accountability rather than restoration, punishment rather than redemption. The Lyon family returned to their daily routines with the knowledge that their daughter's killer would spend his remaining years behind bars, but this information could not fill the emptiness that Katherine and Sheila's absence had created. Justice had been served, but it was a cold comfort compared to what had been lost. John and Mary Lyon faced the challenge of finding meaning and purpose in the years remaining to them after spending so much of their adult lives focused on seeking answers about their daughter's fate. The resolution of the case freed them from uncertainty but required them to confront grief that had been complicated by decades of false hope. Community members who had followed the case experienced their own complex reactions to its resolution. Many felt relief that justice had finally been served, but others struggled with the reality that no legal outcome could truly compensate for the loss of two innocent children. The case became a subject of study for law enforcement agencies seeking to improve their cold case procedures and interjurisdictional cooperation. The lessons learned from the Lyon investigation influenced policies and practices designed to prevent similar delays in future cases. Legal scholars examined the case for its implications regarding plea agreements, witness testimony, and the challenges of prosecuting crimes that occurred decades earlier. The case highlighted both the possibilities and limitations of seeking justice across extended time periods. The Lyon family carried their loss with them as they tried to build whatever life remained to them, sustained by faith and the knowledge that their daughters had not been forgotten. 40-plus years after Katherine and Sheila Lyon walked to Wheaton Plaza on a bright March morning, their memory endures as a symbol of innocence lost and justice pursued across decades of uncertainty. The candlelight vigils that continue to mark the anniversary of their disappearance serve as reminders that some stories transcend their immediate circumstances to become lessons about endurance, faith, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The case of the Lyon sisters became more than a crime story. It evolved into a testament to the power of persistent investigation, the importance of never giving up on victims, and the complex nature of justice in an imperfect world. Their disappearance changed how communities think about child safety, while their eventual justice demonstrated that truth can emerge even after decades of silence. Educational programs that use their story to teach children about safety do so with respect for their memory and recognition that they were real people with dreams, talents, and people who love them. These programs ensure that their deaths contribute to the protection of other children. The investigators who solved their case continue to work other cold cases, carrying forward the lessons learned from the Lyon investigation and the knowledge that persistence can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Their work honors Katherine and Sheila by ensuring that other families receive answers. The Wheaton community that was forever changed by their disappearance has found ways to honor their memory while moving forward with life. The memorial plaque and annual remembrances ensure that they are not forgotten, even as new generations grow up in their former neighborhood. In the end, Katherine and Sheila Lyon are remembered not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as beloved daughters whose short lives had meaning and whose memory continues to inspire efforts to protect other children and seek justice for all victims.